Welcome, everybody, to Sessions with Flo. I am your host, Flo. So, if you didn't know, the platform formerly known as Raza Stand is no longer in existence. So, everything that I will post will be under Flo. So, check out the Instagram, the TikTok, everything will be under Flo. So, today's topic is in regards to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. If you have studied Chicano history, Mexican American history, you will learn about this. But today I'm going to go over the actual treaty and answer the question if the United States actually violated the treaty. Because a lot of folks will say that the U.S. broke its promise, and we will actually go over the articles where it talks about property rights and protection of that, and so on and so forth. So let's get into it. So before we actually get into the actual treaty and the articles in this treaty, let's get into the background of the actual treaty. So before the treaty, we had the Texas Revolution in 1936, and this would ultimately lead to the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which finally ended, right, because Mexico agreed to exchange its occupied territory for $15 million. Right? So this is what took place prior to the treaty, what led to the treaty. Okay? So let's look at the first article, Article 8 of the treaty, which basically states that Mexicans living in territories previously belonging to Mexico would be allowed to remain there. Okay? Mexicans living in the Mexican cession would be allowed to remove themselves while still keeping the private properties belonging to them. So they could choose to sell those properties if they decided to leave permanently. Okay, Mexicans could choose to keep their Mexican citizenship, or become American citizens. Those who chose to stay shall enjoy the same civil liberties as American citizens. Okay, so as you can see, those who stayed or remained or decided to stay would pretty much be treated like American citizens, right? And again, this is something to really look into. Article number 9. Mexicans living in lands previously belonging to Mexico and chose to become American citizens shall be protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property while having freedom of religion. So again, they were told that if they stayed there, that their lands would be protected, that they would be respected, and also they would be allowed to practice their religion. And the majority of Mexicans were obviously Catholic. All right. Article 10, however, was the one that was stricken out. And reason why is because this article said that all land grants made by the Mexican government shall be respected as valid. So you might think to yourself, well, isn't that the same thing as Article 9 and Article 8? No, because many of these land grants were still being processed during the Texas Revolution and Mexican-American War. So this would have allowed them to continue this process under the American administration. So a lot of people who had acquired land in the Texas Revolution and during the Mexican-American War, specifically Anglo immigrants, felt threatened by this. So, and the United States as well. So this is something that was stricken out because they felt that, well, if that's the case, then what are we going to get from this land, right? Reason why it was stricken out. So this is all in writing, and this was, supposed to be something that was promised to Mexicans that would be under this treaty. So that's why Mexico agreed to this treaty. They agreed to, because they wanted to ensure that the people living there were going to enjoy the same liberties that they had enjoyed under the Mexican government. However, things don't go as planned, as we all know in history. And in 1849, you had the gold rush in California specifically. And California grew from 93,000 people to about 380,000 in the span of 10 years. So this obviously changed the population, the demographics in California. Most of them were foreigners. Most of them were actually people from the U.S., specifically the East. So they saw the Mexicans living in these territories as foreigners, right? Because they felt that, okay, well, we just acquired this land, therefore we should have all the rights to it. And they demanded, right? These migrants demanded that the government free up the land for mining or other things that they wanted to use the land for. So California actually passed the Land Act of 1851, which forced Californios to validate these land grants. Because again, a lot of people were claiming these land grants, but some of them had these grants for years, and they were not as specific as those grants that the Anglo immigrants or just the U.S. The way the U.S. processed land grants was different than the way Mexicans and the Spanish processed them, right? So about 813 claims were examined, and about 604 of those claims were actually confirmed. So about 3/4 of those, right, you would say. But that didn't mean that they all got to keep their land, right? Because what ended up happening is that a lot of these people who were landowners had to sell off their land to pay off the high court fees. So it was almost like if you won, it didn't really mean anything because these cases would last years for a long time. In some cases, I think even up to 20 years. Some even up to 40 years. Ridiculous, right? And then you had wealthy squatters, or just any squatters who would come into these areas and apply this pressure to politicians, and it would even frame landowners of fraud. One example of that was Joseph Ives de Montour, who was a landowner in what is now San Francisco. Essentially, he was framed of committing fraud, and he was jailed, so he lost his land. Another case was Dominguez of Rancho Las Virgenes, east of the San Fernando Mission, which I grew up close to. And in her case, she had the land grant prior to, or I think around the same time as Mexican independence. Ultimately, for a long time, she fought it and ended up also losing her land as well. And in Nuevo Mexico and Texas, or Nuevo Mexicanos and Tejanos, were told that the majority of their land grants were invalid because the Mexican government had not fully processed them. Again, these land grants were being processed during the independence movement, after it, and then obviously right after that you had the Texas Revolution, which affected those land grants, or the process of validating the land grants. And the U.S. courts argued that the land had inherited the Mexican government's sovereignty and thus had every right to complete the process of land confirmation. So obviously they were not going to validate them, right? They would say, well, because this was done under this time and it wasn't processed, therefore you didn't really have this land, right? And a lot of these folks in these areas ended up losing their land as well. And lastly, if all those things did not work, violence and intimidation from vigilantes and state police, such as the Texas Rangers, also contributed to Mexicans losing property in these new acquired lands. And also, right after this, you had more Mexican immigrants coming from northern Mexico, all over parts of Mexico. And eventually, the Californio and Nuevo Mexico and Tejano populations were dominated by Mexican immigrants. So it changed. So American settlers, American immigrants saw these new arrivals as foreigners and essentially grouped them all together and overall just took over this area, these new acquired areas, and that is what happened to most of the people who own land in California, Nuevo Mexico, and Texas. So after going over the articles and after studying the exact details and wording in the articles, I would have to say that the United States did violate the terms of the treaty. However, they understood that the government wasn't really going to be able to protect these rights. So that's why Article 10 was ratified and taken out from the treaty, because they knew, I think they knew that they were not going to be able to do this, considering how Americans or Anglo-Saxons looked at land in the West and Native Americans and really anybody who wasn't white. So I would say that they did right? But again, they were quick to cover themselves, and they understood that they would not be able to protect these rights, even though it was written. That's why that specific article, Article 10, was stricken out from the treaty. So now know this is flow. If you don't know, you can't go wrong when you go with the flow. Peace.